We all know that there was something called Old English. And we know that modern English is very different from it. But too often when Old English is discussed in terms of the development from Old English to modern English, what we hear about is just words. It's just all about words. And so we hear, well, the Norman French ran England for a while, and they lent a lot of words to the language. And then there's a list of the words. And it's supposed to be so wonderful that there are all these words. And, frankly, is that really that interesting? I mean, of course, the French were there, and so the French had some words, and so, of course, the people who were already in England started using some of their words. That's fine, but it's kind of listy, really. And I want to show in this lecture that the development from Old English to modern English was about more than, ooh, look at this word. It's about the processes of language change that we've seen over these past few lectures happening from Old English to modern English, just as all languages are the product of these sorts of processes. And so this is to exemplify the sorts of things that we've been seeing and to see how basically one language can turn into another because of the slow movement of changes on the phonological level, on the morphological level, and on the syntactic level. And just to be clear, Old English is not the kind of oldie English of parodies with the thou wouldst fain and the ye and all of that. We're talking about something that is much more different. The thou wouldst fain, that is more like Middle English, and that stage of English begins in about 1100. We're talking about Old English, which would have been completely incomprehensible to us and is a language very much like German. And so let's look at a sample of Old English. No one knows exactly how Old English was pronounced. We can't be quite sure what the vowels were like. Nobody was there to record it, and nobody ever will be. There are all sorts of questions, and so we can only approximate. Nobody knows whether Old English was spoken with a cute lilt or whether it was spoken in a different way. So I'm going to try my version. I don't know how it's going to come out. But this is a passage of Old English, and we're going to keep referring to this passage throughout the lecture. And so this is just a little scene from Bede's Ecclesiastical History. And so, oft in Gebärschippe, often in a banquet, often during a feast, oft in Gebärschippe, Donna there was blisse intinga gedemet. I don't know what accent this is, but somehow I'm just sliding into it. They may have sounded like this. So, Donna there was blisse intinga gedemet. And so then there was joyous occasion decided. So basically everybody said, let's party. Donna there was blisse intinga gedemet. Donna seman gazea verharthan himnelaken. So then the man saw the harp coming to him, the harp being given to him. Donna seman, then the man gazea verharthan, saw the harp himnelaken, him approaching. And so, Donna aras he verschom from famsumble, then arose he from shame from the feast. Donna aras he verschom from famsumble, on quav, and said, Ne kon ik noch singen. Not can I not sing. I can't sing anything. Ne kon ik noch singen. And then, forthon ich nach singen nekure. Because I couldn't sing anything. So, that's a passage of Old English. It's this poor guy who doesn't happen to have musical talent, and they try to give him a harp, and so he shouts out with a rather quizzical urgency, oh dear, I can't sing, I don't have anything to sing for you. But that is this passage of Old English. Now, what is that language? For one thing, you can see that it's not really English at all. This is something which we wouldn't understand spoken. We don't understand it on the page unless we have training. This is a different language altogether. And gradually, step by step over time, this English that we speak came along. But what brought us from this foreign thing to the language that we speak today? Well, it was a bunch of things. One thing that happened was sound change. So, for example, Old English had some sounds that we no longer have in English. One thing that makes this language exotic to us, for example, is a word like symbol. And this is when he arose for shame from the feast. And so thona arase for shame from them symble. Symble was the word for feast, and what it had was what we've seen before as a high front rounded vowel. And so it's the cute lune sound in French. Symble. So it wasn't sumble. It was symble. That was the word for feast. That was a different sound. We do not have that sound in English anymore, and so that's part of what gives Old English a different sound. And there was also a nice velar fricative, and so it's the sound in Bach, except we English speakers really are more inclined to say Bach because we don't have a velar fricative. There was one in Old English, just as there is today in German. And so, for example, I can't sing anything. Ne kann ich Nacht singen. And so, was still there. So today we see remnants in the spelling of what used to be velar fricatives in words like night, or either nighttime or knights in shining armor. But we no longer have the sound. That was still present in Old English. More to the point, in Old English, we can see the development of new phonemes in modern English. And an example of that is our friends, the interdental fricatives. And so we have our voiceless interdental fricative, th, as in thin, and then we have our voiced interdental fricative, the, as in this. Those are different phonemes in our language. In Old English, however, and this will help us to review and get across the notion of phoneme and allophone, in Old English, the was only something that happened to th in a certain context. The was an allophone of th. There was a grand concept of thness, so to speak. And so you could either have th, or sometimes it would come out as the. And as you might predict, that happened, the voiced version happened, when this element came between vowels. Vowels have voices, and so th, when it came between, say, two O's, came out as the. And so, the was just a kind of th in Old English. Now, in the written language, they were used, the symbols for th and the, which are called thorn and eth, were used interchangeably. Nobody really cared. It was not highly codified. But in terms of the actual sound, the was something that only happened in between vowels. Now, as time went by, something happened to th in some other places. When th came at the beginning of a word, because of rapid pronunciation and heavy use, when it came at the beginning of little heavily used words, it started being pronounced the. Now, this only happened on certain words. If you think about it, even in modern English, although th and the are separate phonemes today, the only comes at the beginning of a certain small collection of mostly little words. And so the, this, that, these, those, they, then, there, thus, thence, though. If you think about it, if there was going to be a new word, it wouldn't begin with the. Like, let's say that you saw a bird walk into your yard with 3 wings, and it camouflages against anything that it walks past, so you can never see it because it's plaid, it looks like a bush, it looks like a person. And so there's this weird bird. We have to give it a name. And let's say that the name is going to begin with what we spell as TH. Now, you might call it Thaddeus, you might call it focal. You wouldn't call it a vincum or a valley. That would not feel like English. The sound is not really something that occurs at the beginning of a word, except in a very few. Nevertheless, that does mean that in the modern language, the has become a real sound, because you can't predict. There are words like this and that, where you have it at the beginning, but then there's thick and thin, where you have the voiceless version coming at the beginning. So now they are completely different sounds. In Old English, the was just something that happened to th in one particular context. And so we have developed a phoneme in our language. To an Old English speaker, the was not anything. It was just what happened when th was in between two vowels. So that's some sound change from Old English to modern English. And then there's the issue of how to make words. There's the issue of Old English morphology. Now, morphology in Old English. Old English had a lot more affixal morphology than modern English. Old English indicated grammatical gender, and so not just biological gender as to whether something is a man or a woman or a rooster or a hen, but there were things allotted into grammatical genders rather arbitrarily, just like in French we have le bateau, as if a boat is a man, and then la lune, the moon, is a woman for some reason. So this was a language where morphology was yoked to indicate that kind of thing much more than in English. And so even with the word the, we can see that we're dealing with a very different language. So just as German has der, die, das for masculine, feminine, and neuter definite articles, in Old English things were very similar. And so you can see that there was a masculine, a feminine, and a neuter definite article, and then a whole different one, tha for the plural. And then all of this changed according to whether we were in the genitive, that is the possessive case, and so the boy's ball, or the dative, and that indicates to-ness, and so giving something to your grandmother, that's the dative, and the accusative, i.e. when something is an object, and then even in the instrumental, in terms of Fred Flintstone hit Barney with a hammer, that's the instrumental. I don't know why I thought of that. But here you see that in terms of the morphological typology of languages, where we saw that there are analytic languages where basically morphemes are separate, like say in Vietnamese, and then agglutinative languages like Swahili, fusional languages like English, and polysynthetic languages like, for example, Chinook. And we saw that in a fusional language, an ending can often mean two things. And so, for example, the S in the third person singular in English means both third person singular and present tense. Here in Old English, we see that that kind of fusionality was much richer. And so, for example, if we go back to our sentence with the feast, and so vona arase, then arose he rose up, for shoma from them sumle. The them is the word for the, but it's connoting all at the same time the definite, the dative, and the masculine or the neuter. All of that is on that one item. And so in Old English, we're dealing with heavy fusion of a type that, for example, our definite article in modern English does not have. We just have the, and we do have the, and so technically we have two allomorphs of it. The apple, that's before a verb, and then the peacock, that's before a consonant. But that is much less of a load than something like them in Old English. We can see word building in Old English. So, for example, we have this word nealaken. So the man saw the harp approaching him. Notice how if I keep saying it, you kind of start to understand it. At least I'm beginning to understand it. But then the man saw the harp coming to him. Nealaken was actually originally a compound word. It was nea, which was near, and then there was lakan, which was rise, and so it rose near. So nealaken was a compound word. So this is something that happens in all languages all the time. Kind of like in the earlier lecture where in Vietnamese we saw how the word for begin is actually a compound of take and start. That's a process that is foreign to no language, and we see a bit of it here. Now, in Old English we also see grammatical change, and the grammatical change is often quite dramatic. For one thing, we see the grammaticalization of the sort that we saw in the previous lecture. So when our man is pleading that he is incapable of singing a song, he uses two forms, actually, the two alternates of the negative. First, he says, ne kan ik not singen. And so, I can not singen. Then, forthan, because ich nacht singen nikule. And so, at first, in Old English, although we don't see this stage, but we can presume that in an earlier stage of English, you could say just ne. And so your negative marker would have been, for example, ik ne kan singen, I can't sing. Now, as it happens a lot in languages, something similar has happened in French with pas, which used to mean step. You emphasize the negation by putting something after. Now, ne, wicht, comes together, and you have this item, nacht. And so this now is the source of not, for one thing. It comes down to us as not, but that's a rather rarefied word. But more to the point, it ends up becoming what we now know as not. Now, as time went by, the original ne eroded. And so we no longer have that ne. We just have the not. And so for us, the word not, N-O-T, is our negator. That's how you do it. But to somebody who spoke an earlier form of English, that was just a kind of decoration that you added afterwards when you had used the original negator, which was a word ne that we no longer have. So that is a grammaticalization. Another thing that we see in terms of grammatical change is that Old English liked to keep verbs at the end of sentences. And so, for example, in our first phrase here, oft in geberschippe, often during a banquet, then there was joyous occasion decided. Dan there was blisse intinger gedemed. So here it is at the end. Or then the man saw the harp him approach. Dan is man gezet the harp van him neerleggen. Here it is at the end. Or because I couldn't sing anything. For van ik nach zingen ne koede. And so the koede is could, and that's at the end. That is something that is common in Germanic languages to some extent, in all of those grammars, and Old English used to be that way. And that means that if we were going to make a syntactic tree for Old English, it would be quite different from the one for modern English. I would have introduced the phrase structure rules in a completely different way. For us, the notion that a language would have its verbs at the end, such as in Japanese, or even sometimes, as in German, seems very counterintuitive and peculiar. To an Old English speaker, that was just the sort of thing that happened every day. But there have been some things that have happened to Old English syntax that have really turned it upside down, and they are still debated by scholars of the subject today. One thing that you do not see in our passage, or here in our passage, and which does not exist in Old English, is something called do support. And what I mean by do support is the way we use that peculiar little word do in contexts like, do you sing? You know, I sing. Do you sing? Now, of course, all of us say that a million times a day, use that construction a million times a day, but actually it's rather peculiar. I sing. Do you sing? Think about any other language that you've learned. Did it have that? If anything, you have to unlearn that. You have to unlearn that the way that you make a question is to stick do in. Or to negate a sentence. I sing. I do not sing. Why? What's the do doing in there? Shouldn't it be I sing not? What's wrong with that? That's the way it used to be in Old English. But for some reason, we have to say I do. You know, what are you doing? You know, why do you have to put that in? That is something which linguists call do support. And one has to wonder, how'd that start? You know, why is that there? And we've talked about grammaticalization, and so maybe there's this notion that because doing is doing, that there's going to have to be this abstract contribution of the verb to do to every single negative and questioning sentence that we utter. But obviously that is a very peculiar development. And the fact of the matter is we see it developing in Middle English documents. It's not in Old English documents. And it's something familiar to us in Shakespeare's English, where it's used even in a context we don't use it in. It's used in the affirmative as well. So, in Hamlet, Gertrude says, alas, how is't with you that you do bend your eye on vacancy, and with the incorporeal air do hold discourse? And then Hamlet answers, and he uses it in an affirmative sentence. And so, my pulse as yours doth temperately keep time, and makes as healthful music. And so these are these do's. And so it becomes very well established. Eventually, you have to use do when you are negating a sentence and when you are questioning a sentence. And it's very odd. Even most linguists don't realize how odd this is. But you think, well, okay, it's just a grammaticalization, but okay, where else has that happened? And I personally am aware of that kind of usage of do in exactly 3 places. One is that there is a language where be is used in a similar way. It's not obligatory, but it's similar. And it's a language called Nanai. It's spoken by about 2.5 people in Siberia. And that's one of 6,000 languages. You look all over the place and you just find these people in, you know, kind of herding their yaks in this one place. So it's extremely rare, and they're not even doing it with the verb to do. They're doing it with to be. Then there are a couple of dialects spoken by about 4.5 people of Italian. Way up in the mountains, these are non-standard dialects of Italian, where only in questions, not in the negative and not in the affirmative, only in questions, they use do in this way. For the record, this is documented particularly in the Monese dialect of Italian. Only there. Other than that, you can go all over the world. Imagine yourself in a little plane, I don't know why it's little, and you're flying all over the world, all the languages people speak, Japanese and Tagalog and Klingon and Pig Latin and everything that people are speaking. There's nothing like this do. There are things that are kind of like it, but nothing just like this except in one place, the third place. And that is the Celtic languages that are also spoken in Great Britain or have been alongside English. And so Welsh is a Celtic language. It's in the Celtic family of Indo-European. Cornish is no longer natively spoken, but that was a closely related Celtic language spoken there before people who spoke early English came to the island. Now, in these languages, you have something that is very much like the way do support works in English. So, for example, here in Welsh, we have I opened. And so the way you say it is with the do verb, which here is nes. And so nes I agor. And then did I open uses their do verb, and I did not open uses a do verb. Now, in Welsh, it's not obligatory. Nevertheless, the way they do it is exactly the way it was done, for example, in Shakespeare's time. Then in Cornish, Cornish is now dead. There's a revival movement, but in terms of somebody being spoken Cornish to in the cradle and learning it as their main language, that is a thing of the past. But we have ample documentation of it, and there was something very similar. And so you would use your do verb, and it was optional but very commonly used to say I love, and you would use your do verb to make it into a question. Only places in the world where it's this similar to what goes on in English. Only languages on earth, and they were present on the island when English was brought to the island. Now, nevertheless, there is this whole industry of describing how do support arose in English, where supposedly it just happened by itself. And the fact that the only languages in the world that do it very much like English were spoken on that very island. And you know, the island is like the size of a parking lot. These people were jammed together on that only island, that they happen to be there. Somehow that's irrelevant. It's just an accident, or I swear to God, for many of them, somehow it's not interesting. They're more interested in saying, well, do what have happened through this series, and here we see in these documents, and they just kind of go on and on and on. And somebody will point out, somebody might be me. Have you ever noticed that Welsh and Cornish have the exact same thing, and that they actually were there, and that if you look in early documents about how English was run, it's clear that there were many Celts hanging around, permeating society, and people were marrying Celts? Don't you think that there's some kind of causal relationship? And people just say, well, maybe, and they just kind of, no, that really won't do. And I think that the case is painfully clear, and there are more and more linguists who are thinking in the way that I do. I didn't even start this, I joined them. But there is what's called a Celtic hypothesis, and I'm sorry, it's correct. The reason that English has this do support is because it was learned as a second language by millions and millions of people whose languages had do support a long time ago. And this was not happening in written documentation in Old English because it was considered non-standard. It starts appearing in documentation almost ominously suddenly in Middle English. And so one of our syntactic changes was a result of contact with other languages, and that is as important in how a language changes as anything else. And finally, one thing that we see in the development from Old English to Modern English is just an awful lot of loss of affixation. And so, for example, we saw how the definite article is a much less complex business in the modern language than it was in the earlier language. And in general, you had case marking on nouns in Old English. So our word for feast, symbol, the actual word is symbel, and our form, symble, is a case marker. That's actually a dative case marker, thamsymble. And so tham is our dative definite article. There was an inflectional suffix. We say sing, they said singan. And so we say to sing to replace that in a sense. They had singan. Just like in German you would say singen. Just like in the typical European language, you have an infinitive ending. English mysteriously does not have one. You had the participial why can I suddenly not pronounce that word? You had the participial prefix, g. And so, oft in Gebärschippe, often during banquets, then there was joyous occasion decided. And so that of us blisse intinga gedeemed, g. Now, that has become our word deemed. We don't have the g anymore. Off goes the affix. And that has happened to such an extent in English that it's rather peculiar, because Germanic is a relatively compact group. It consists of Icelandic, Faroese, Swedish, Norwegian, Danish, Dutch, Frisian, German, Yiddish, English, and Afrikaans. So it's a relatively compact group, and it's interesting that only English has lost that much affixation. Something very peculiar happened in the history of the English language, it seems. And there's some people who seem to think that this was just an accident, but I think that they lack imagination. It seems that in the history of English, something peculiar happened that left it a language strangely denuded of what the typical Germanic language has. If you learn German, you have to master 3 grammatical genders, you have to deal with many words varying according to whether they are a nominative, accusative, dative, or genitive. Suddenly, in English, you don't. It was the Vikings. The Vikings invaded Great Britain starting in 787, according to most documentation, and they were Danes. They were what we would now call Norwegians, and they invaded, they married into society, certainly they learned Old English, and there were a great many of them. Their invasion shows up vibrantly in the genetic blueprint of Britons today, and it seems clear that they learned a kind of schoolboy Old English. They got things across, but they ended up doing the sorts of things to the language that all of us do to a language when we're learning it in a classroom. And there were so many of them, and so many of them were daddies exposing their children to their way of speaking English, that way of speaking English affected what English actually was throughout the island. And that this happened seems especially clear in that the Vikings settled mostly in what, if you look on the map, is northeasterly of the line, the Danelaw line. The agreement was that they would run things up there and everybody would be left alone on the other side of the line. That is where the endings start falling away most quickly, whereas down in the southwest, old-fashioned things, sorts of things that you expect English to have as a good card-carrying Germanic language, persist as late as 1886. That's when the book came out. So we're talking about when there were presidents like Grover Cleveland and Benjamin Harrison, and there was electricity, and, you know, a relatively modern era, except that it wasn't. Way down in Cornwall in the southwest, you still had some indication of grammatical gender. And so, for example, in as late as the late 19th century, in the English of Cornwall, if you were talking about something that's inanimate, like a rock or a blanket or a hangnail or something like that, then you would talk about this blanket or that blanket. But if you're talking about something that you could call personal, and that is usually animate things, but also things that are dear to you, like if for some reason it was with them tools, or I presume if it were Linus it would be his blanket, then you would say das for this, and you would say thick for that. And so you had a different gender. So das dog, thick cat. And so that still persisted down there where Vikings had never settled. So Old English to modern English was a very dynamic process, and we've seen how the things that we have seen in the previous lectures, as well as some that we have seen less of but are equally important, have made the difference between then and now.